Hello, I'm Mary Smith, President of the American Bar Association, and I'm pleased to be presenting another episode of the ABA Presidential Speaker Series. Under the theme, Lifting Our Voices, Charting the Future, this speaker series is a series of candid conversations that bring together leading minds to discuss the issues of our time. Today, we will discuss the work of the ABA Task Force for American Democracy and be joined by the task force's two co-chairs, Secretary Jay Johnson, former Secretary of Homeland Security, Judge J. Michael Luttig, former federal judge, and the conversation will be moderated by David French, New York Times columnist. So with that, David?
Thank you very much, President Smith. As President Smith mentioned, I'm a columnist for the New York Times, longtime attorney, and I'm incredibly honored to start this conversation and to launch this task force here with the two distinguished co-chairs. We've got Secretary Jay Johnson, who is the former United States Secretary of Homeland Security from 2013 to 2017 in the Obama administration. Before that, he was General Counsel of the Department of Defense, also during the Obama administration. He's been a federal prosecutor, the General Counsel of the Department of the Air Force. He's also been an attorney in private practice for a very long time. Secretary Johnson is a longtime Democrat, and across from him is a longtime Republican, Judge Michael Luttig. Judge Luttig served in the Reagan administration. He served in the first Bush administration. He was appointed to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals by the first President Bush. And most recently and most famously, he helped block the effort to steal the 2020 election by rendering some invaluable legal advice to Vice President Pence at a key moment in American history. And both Secretary Johnson and Judge Luttig have been indispensable in vocalizing a defense of American democracy since those crisis days in 2020. And I'm incredibly honored to join them today. So why would there be an ABA task force on democracy? At this point, I almost don't think we need to really ask that question anymore because there's been so many signs that our democracy is under siege. Most recently and most notably, the very effort to steal the 2020 election that the judge combated so very effectively and in his own right. We're seeing an increasing interest in the United States in illiberalism, authoritarianism. We have the leading contender for the Republican nomination. Reports are coming out of that he's interested in, his team is interested in a number of authoritarian moves if he's going to win another term to the presidency, including perhaps liberal use of the Insurrection Act. At the same time, American trust in institutions is declining dramatically. Very few institutions in American life outside the military, and surprisingly enough, Amazon.com, have a lot of trust with the American public, especially the branches of government, again, aside from the military, do not have a lot of trust anymore. Americans are fed up. There is a term that attaches to a majority of Americans right now called the exhausted majority. They're done. They're fed up. They're over it. And sadly, they're manifesting their anger in exhaustion. They're not engaging to save democracy. They're retreating. For understandable reasons. The political world is toxic, it's nasty, it's full of bullies, and a lot of people understandably are retreating at the very moment when we need good folks to advance, to stand up. So let me just begin with the basics. Secretary Johnson, what is it that drew you to this effort?
I have to start by saying that Judge Luttig is clearly the brains of this outfit, and the reason I said yes to this task force, among the many things I have going on in my life right now, is to co-chair this with him. He is one of the heroes of January 6th in my judgment. And what brings us together? He's a Republican. I'm a Democrat. He's a conservative. I consider myself a moderate progressive. He worked for Reagan Bush. I worked for Clinton Obama. He's from Texas. I'm from New York. One of us has a full head of boyish hair. But we both believe in the oath we took to support and defend the Constitution. And we both took that and do take that very seriously. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in democratic norms. Whatever democratic norms yield by way of political result. And we see our democracy under threat right now for all of the reasons you've cited, David. Americans are turned off and tuned out. They watch our Congress and not even do the simple stuff like pass a budget on time every year. We fall into acrimony and disagreement over a budget, over immigration reform and the like. We see that there is an impulse to want to support someone with autocratic impulses himself. And we see claims that the 2020 election was stolen. A large percentage of Americans believe that, contrary to any court ruling, any evidence. And we're worried. And we're worried about the future of our democracy. Frequent topic of discussion is whether Donald Trump, frankly, is the cause or a symptom. And even Judge Luttig and I would disagree on that. I believe he's a symptom of a larger problem. He's a symptom on steroids, but he's the symptom of a larger problem that, that gives rise to 50% of the voting public wanting to support someone like him, despite all of his flaws. And my view is that the starting point for remedying this situation is restoring in the public at large some sense that they have a stake in our government, through voting, through participation in town halls, school board meetings, raising the awareness of the public at large on how they contribute to our democracy. And coupled with that, looking at the incentives and disincentives for certain political behavior among our elected officials. I think a large part of the reason we are where we are is too many politicians today are incentivized to engage in bad political behavior, incentivized to appeal to the extremes across the political spectrum, as opposed to seeking compromise, seeking broad consensus to get stuff done on behalf of the American people, the result of which is that nothing gets done. And so my view is that we need to go to the basics of what is leading us to where we are today. Our task force was launched last March. We were appointed by ABA President Mary Smith, and we're looking at this situation now. We're going to go on listening tours, and we're going to issue a report in August of 2024 at the ABA convention that occurs then. That is a very long-winded answer to your initial question, and I'm happy to turn this over to the brains of this outfit, Judge Michael Luttig.
So, Judge, many people have heard the story of January 6th and your intervention in January 6th, prior to January 6th, to convince Vice President Pence that he didn't have the constitutional authority to overturn an election. Kind of sad that it took some convincing, but you've been engaged ever since in this battle for American democracy. So what brings you here to this task force, and how do you see the state of things?
For all the reasons that both of you describe, American democracy and the rule of law are the causes of our times. Never before in the history of our country, since its founding almost 250 years ago, has there been such an existential threat to our democracy. As both of you said, today, as a result of the former president's failed effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election and his persistence for the 3 years since then, with the support of the Republican Party, no longer do many millions of Americans believe in democracy itself. And they no longer believe that democracy is necessarily the best form of government for America and for Americans. Those same millions of Americans no longer trust and have faith and confidence in their elections because they've been told for 3 years now by the former president and his Republican allies that our elections are not to be trusted because they say the last election was stolen from them. This despite the fact now, 3 years later, that there is not one shred of evidence of that the election was stolen from the former president, and indeed he lost that election fair and square. But what I'm concerned about now, and I think what I have called the greatest threat to democracy today, is that the former president's conduct in attempting to overturn a presidential election in the United States and his violent rhetoric in attacking the institutions of democracy and law in our country over the past 3 years, and indeed since he first took office in 2016, he has normalized that conduct and that rhetoric into American society and culture and into the American political experience. The country, it's not possible, in my view, that the country will ever fully recover from this, nor should we expect the country ever to recover from this. These were existential events to our American democracy and to the rule of law. And to this day, that war on democracy and the rule of law that the former president and his allies instigated on January 6th, it is raging even greater today than it was on January 6th as we go into the 2024 election.
You raise a really interesting topic, which is placing the present moment in historical context. And you made a pretty bold statement. You said this is the greatest existential threat to our democracy. And I'm going to turn to Secretary Johnson, and I'm going to ask you to sort of, where do you put this in historical context? I mean, we had some pretty major threats in the past. We had 1861 to 1865. We had the election of 1876 that resulted in a compromise that essentially threw Black Americans under the bus for almost 100 years. Where are you placing this historically?
When I ask old political hands who've been in Congress in Washington for decades, the consistent response I get is, oh, well, it's not nearly as bad as, some other period. It's not nearly as bad as when Charles Sumter was almost clubbed to death on the Senate floor. It's not nearly as bad as the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. But we're in an unprecedented situation. And the simple fact, I think, that reflects that, the leading candidate on the Republican side for president, when I say leading, he's leading by almost 50 points among his nearest rival, is under felony indictment in 4 different jurisdictions, and his base doesn't seem to care.
Right.
There's a realistic possibility that he's going to be convicted in at least one of those jurisdictions. Judge Luttig, if he knows, can tell us whether or not he knows of anyone who's ever beaten 4 separate felony criminal indictments. I don't think so. So chances are he's going to be convicted in one or more of those jurisdictions. And if you look at the federal sentencing guidelines for the offenses to which he's been charged, it means jail time. But notwithstanding all of that, his poll numbers seem to go up. What does that say about our democracy? What does that say about what the voters think they want in their leader? And to me, it reflects not just grievance and anger at Washington, it also reflects a profound misunderstanding of what a president does. The presidency is a job. It is the most demanding job in the nation. How many of us would hire someone for a job that was important to us? A person who is under 4 separate indictments in 4 separate jurisdictions and rely on that person to do the job. I wouldn't. I don't think you would either. I don't think anybody listening to us would either. And so I'm astounded that we've reached a state in our democracy where there's a decent chance that a leading candidate for president is going to go to jail at some point. That is unprecedented. That is, in many respects, a low in our democracy. The trial calendar interfaced with the political calendar is going to get really messy. It's going to be a situation we've never seen before. So very certainly in that respect, we are on unprecedented ground here. And I don't think either one of us can tell you how it's going to come out.
I think it's very important for the lawyers in our country to speak very precisely about these issues. And so what the secretary hears back from his friends is imprecision. It's not their fault. It's just that's the way the society talks, and probably is the only way that we could talk to each other and ever get anything done. But when I say that it's there's never been a threat to American democracy, I'm using that phrase in the specific sense that democracy is the form of government in the United States. It was a genius of our founding fathers. It's incorporated into the Constitution of the United States. But the basic idea of a democracy is that all power resides in the people. That's why the Constitution begins, "We the people." And we the people delegate or loan our power to our elected representatives in order that they will represent us wielding that power in public office in Washington, in particular. Just as we invested those officials with our power, we can always divest them of that power under our Constitution. But it's our elections that comprise Americans' democracy. And therefore, to try to steal an election in the United States is, as I said to the Congress, to steal America's democracy. So we lawyers have a special obligation in the year and years ahead to be very precise when we talk about American democracy. And if we are successful in that precision, there will be far, far fewer people who could ever disagree with us that American democracy is threatened at the moment.
If I could build on what the judge just said, David, before you ask your next question, one thing that is different now, when Al Gore lost the 2000 election, I'm sure he personally believed he had won that election, but he knew he had to concede, because to not concede would be crossing a red line. Same thing in 1960. I suspect Richard Nixon was convinced that the Kennedys stole Illinois from him and that he had really won the election, but he knew he had to concede because to refuse to concede would cross a red line of our constitutional norms. The 45th president doesn't see it that way and doesn't respect that constitutional norm, and was prepared to do everything he could do to try to overturn the will of the people and the will of the Electoral College even. And so, I come back to what I said before. We're in an unprecedented place because that very same person wants to get elected president again.
David, the very symbol of our democracy is the acceptance of the will of the people and the peaceful transfer of power from one incumbent president to his successor. And for the first time in American history, we did not have that in 2020. And we don't have that today as a consequence of the former president's stated intentions to do whatever is necessary, if necessary, to prevail in the next election should he or the Republican nominee lose at the hands of the American voter.
So I have this kind of distinction that I've tried to argue ever since the Stop the Steal, the big lie, that in 2020, what we saw was the political branches of government, that American democracy was saved through the political branches of government through partisanship. In other words, it was a majority of elected Republicans who went along with, who refused to certify the election. A majority of elected Republicans, the election was only certified because Democrats voted to certify the election. If it had been up to just Republicans, the election would not have been certified. But on a bipartisan basis in the legal system, now we know of the lawyers who've been indicted and the lawyers who helped Trump try to steal the election. But if you look at the judiciary that fielded those roughly 60 or so cases, it was Democratic judges, Democratic appointed judges, and Republican appointed judges alike who rejected the big lie, who rejected the effort to steal the election. And so in many ways, I've argued the legal system has performed well in defending our democracy these last several years. That of these American institutions that are under siege, that the legal system actually has performed pretty well. And there are reasons for hope in that area. So Secretary Johnson, am I wrong or am I right?
I think you're right. Notwithstanding some of the baseless, ridiculous, false assertions that were made by advocates for the former president, the courts held firm, Republican appointees and Democratic appointees. Not one court bought into the Stop the Steal conspiracy theory. And on a larger scale, I believe that our courts have performed as we would hope to preserve democracy. It will be irony that it's the courts that preserve democracy and not the political branches of our government. For a long time, the courts used to defer to the political branches of government when it came to things like political questions, national security, immigration law and policy. I see the courts becoming more and more involved in resolving what should be political disputes because the political branches of government refuse to resolve them themselves. And so I am hopeful that the judicial branch of our government continues in that vein. And I'm sure Judge Luttig he can speak much more eloquently to that than I can.
I think that the federal courts, and for that matter, the state courts, have distinguished themselves over the past 8 years to the court. And and I will say to the individual judge, the processes in the federal courts and the state courts have worked exactly as the Constitution intended for them to work. And that is that the men and women who occupy seats on the federal and state courts, they interpret the Constitution in the state court cases, their state constitution, and the laws of both the United States and the respective states without regard to any other extrajudicial factor, such as politics writ large, their own individual politics, whatever that may be, or any other extra legal consideration. That's if American democracy is to be saved, it will be saved by the Supreme Court of the United States of America. And I was just doing an interview with Colorado Public Radio this morning about the pending case today that's going to be argued in the Colorado Supreme Court about the former president's disqualification under the 14th Amendment. And the interviewer asked me point blank, do you believe that the Supreme Court of the United States will ever disqualify the former president from the ballots? I wasn't intending to dodge the question, but I said, I have full faith and confidence in the institution of the Supreme Court. And indeed, I've always had a reverence for the Supreme Court of the United States. And to his credit, the interviewer said, I understand, Judge, but I asked you the specific question. Do you believe this Supreme Court would ever disqualify him from office? And I said, yes, I do, because that's what the 14th Amendment, Section 3 provides.
Let's stay zeroed in on the legal profession for understandable reasons. This is an ABA task force. One of the things I thought was interesting about the effort to steal the big lie, the effort to steal the 2020 election, was that it wasn't just that there were Republican appointed judges who refused these Trump's claims, including, by the way, some people who were on the Trump Judge Pryor, who was on the short list, was one of the judges. He had a vested interest. If Trump won, he was on the short list for Supreme Court, and he ruled against Trump in the 11th Circuit. And so we've talked about the judges, but what was interesting to me is if you knew anything about the conservative legal world, if you're looking at Four Seasons Total Landscaping press conference, for example, that's not exactly the New York Yankees of conservative lawyers. It was more like, with all due apologies to the Toledo lawyers watching, it's more like the Toledo Mud Hens than the New York Yankees of lawyers. Many of the best and brightest minds in the conservative legal movement, they were out of it. They did not participate. So going into 2024, to both of you, what do you think is the state of the legal profession? And Judge, you're going to have more visibility on the state of the conservative side of the legal profession. What is the state of the legal profession going into 2024? Is it ready to continue this sort of its finest hour, so to speak? Do you see cracks? Do you see vulnerabilities? Give us your perspective. Secretary Johnson, you go first.
According to reports, Stephen Miller, should Trump be reelected, is out looking for lawyers to populate the Trump administration round two. And apparently they've decided that the Heritage Foundation won't go far enough to pursue their agenda. And so they've left them behind as sort of sellouts. When I was in government as a lawyer, general counsel of the Department of the Air Force, general counsel of the Department of Defense, as an executive branch lawyer, I knew my job was not simply to just come up with whatever legal argument I could cobble together in support of a proposition, but to land on what I knew was the most sustainable, defensible position in law that the legal research suggested to me was where the center was. And the problem that I see with the state of lawyering in government, at least those who are political appointees, is that they've lost that sense. And too many lawyers are irresponsibly looking. We saw this in the Stop the Steal episode. Too many lawyers are simply willing to come up with an argument that has some superficial appeal in the hope that some court will buy it, rather than the best, most sustainable position of law. And the way our checks and balances work, there are too few people, unless you are before a court, there are too few people that can check that, certainly with executive branch lawyering. And so I always reiterate that the role of the lawyer, the role of the government lawyer, is not simply to come up with whatever argument you can make, like you would as a litigator, but to advise your client on the most sustainable, supportable, strongest position you can. And I think lawyers in government need to be reminded of that now and again. Certainly lawyers in the Department of Defense heard that from me over and over again when I was their top lawyer. And sometimes we forget that.
So, Judge, I'll just tell you, I'm worried about this upcoming election. I'm worried about the lawyers who would populate a Trump team in the second term. One of the things that I don't think enough Americans quite appreciate is in 2016, because Trump knew exactly nothing about any of this. He largely handed the keys to the legal kingdom over to traditional, mainstream, conservative legal scholars and activists. And a lot of them spent 4 years basically putting both feet on the brakes of Trump, trying to control and rein his worst impulses. And that has obviously irritated him a lot. It is now quite obvious that, the next Trump term, if it happens, would be Trump unleashed. My concern, Judge, is that there are enough lawyers now in the sort of conservative legal world more broadly to fully staff a Trump administration as Trump unleashed, who would facilitate and aid him in his efforts to be Trump unleashed. Am I wrong on that? Or do you think we do now? Is there now a critical mass of lawyers on the right who would be more than happy to assist and facilitate Trump's vengeance tour, so to speak?
No, you're unquestionably right, David. The way I was going to frame my answer to your question to the secretary was this: just as the former president has normalized into our culture and society his conduct and his rhetoric, so also has he normalized into our society and into the legal profession in particular his stated views that the institutions of our democracy and of our law are corrupt. So today, as he begins to appear before the various courts in connection with the prosecutions, what do we see? He's attacking not just the courts, but the individual judges as being corrupt. And that's what he's done for 8 years, now, and he's going to continue it at least through the next election. Well, this is exactly why millions and millions of Americans today, David, they believe that the Department of Justice is corrupt. They believe that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, is corrupt. They believe that the federal courts are corrupt and that the state courts have always been corrupt. And this is a former president of the United States of America, who's the presumptive Republican nominee in 2024, who's been telling America that for 7-8 years now. And what do you get? You get millions and millions of Americans who believe him. And he is supported in that by the Republican Party to this day. I think I said in the New York Times essay that the former president of the Republican Party, clearly intend to run for the presidency, campaigning against the Constitution and the rule of law in America. And I cited chapter and verse. I didn't just make that up. That's what they were saying the week that I wrote that New York Times essay. And of course, that is indeed what they're going to do as late as today and through the rest of the campaign season. So that is a broadside attack and assault on American democracy, the rule of law, and the institutions of democracy and law in the United States. There's no room for disagreement over what it is. Those are his words and the Republican Party's words about America.
So let's move more to the work of the task force itself. So Secretary Johnson, Judge Luttig, you are both co-chairs of the task force, but you are by no means the only people involved here. The list of individuals, of course, we've got President Smith involved. We have former members of Congress like Dick Gephardt. We have Carly Fiorina. We have Danielle Allen, Vice Admiral James Crawford. I mean, I can go Benjamin Ginsburg, Judge Thomas Griffith, Richard Haas, Sherry Lynn Eiffel. I mean, this is it's a who's who in many ways of people. Jeffrey Rosen, Heather Cox Richardson. I could just go on. Judy Woodruff. There's so many people here who are really a who's who of thought leaders, legal thought leaders in this country. What's your vision for the work of this task force? How do you see it fitting into the work of the ABA? How do you see it fitting into the work of the legal profession more broadly? And Mr. Secretary, we'll start with you.
First of all, the task force is not just lawyers. We didn't limit ourselves to lawyers. We've got people like Judy Woodruff and others serving who are just as passionate about the defense of our democracy as anybody with a law degree. And I've been really impressed by, after we announced in August this task force, a number of people who have come forward wanting to serve, wanting to help us, wanting to support us. I was on MSNBC the other night, and I'm told that after my interview talking about this task force, some people called into the ABA and pledged money to support us.
That's fantastic.
And there are a number of state bar associations who have offered their support and help. And so my view, and Judge Luttig can speak to this too, my view is that at the end of this process, we'll have a set of recommendations that will have behind them the imprimatur of a really, really impressive group of Americans from across the political spectrum who all agree that this set of solutions, separate and apart from politics and your political beliefs, this set of solutions are what is necessary to fix our democracy, to strengthen our democracy. And that's why I'm so pleased that this is I'm sure the most distinguished group, nonpartisan, of Americans I've ever been associated with.
David, I would echo every word of the secretaries and just add that he and I are both literally honored to be co-chairs of this task force. The 30 plus members of the task force, as you suggested, and as I said the other day, they are to the person some of the most, the leaders, national leaders, and some of the most articulate, impassioned defenders of American democracy ever assembled. For the past, our secretaries in my secret, which I'll tell you if you promise not to tell anyone else, is that we chose these people because they had been leading this charge for the past 6-7 years.
Yeah.
In fact, I said to the secretary, and he certainly agreed, I said, we don't really have to reinvent the wheel here. These people are so impressive. They've actually invented the wheel and all four wheels over the past 3 years. All we have to do is just read what they've written and said and go with it. Now, to that latter point, the legal profession, the lawyers in America, the 1.5 million lawyers in America are uniquely positioned and they're uniquely obligated to support and defend America's democracy and the rule of law. The lawyers take an oath to support the Constitution of the United States. They're officers of the court, and we intend to leverage that and those lawyers across America through the local and state bar associations to take the message out across America about the importance of American democracy to their everyday lives, and the fact that it is imperiled at the moment for the reasons that it is, and there's no one better position, but frankly, there's no one better able and obligated to do this in the country than the legal profession. And of course, as you said, that at bottom, the effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election was orchestrated and planned by lawyers because it was a legally inspired, at least, plan to steal America's democracy from the American people.
So let's talk a little bit about what's coming up. So there's going to be listening tours coming up, and here's some of the states. See if you can. Let's see if we can discern the non-random choices made here: Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Michigan, North Carolina. With the exception of North Carolina, those are all states that were targeted by the Trump effort to steal the 2020 election. These were states targeted for the fake elector scheme, et cetera. So what's the hope of what do you want to accomplish with listening tours in these places?
Well, we're going to take the message, David, to the people in the states that we believe need to hear the message. There's nothing random about this election. I know that was just tongue in cheek, but it was precisely the opposite.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that as lawyers, we know what we're doing, and I'd like to think that was the first telltale signs that we do. But Mr. Secretary, I interrupted you.
These were hotly contested states. They were battleground states. They were the hot spots for some of the attempts to install fake electors and try to get a recount and some of the litigation challenges. And it's not just us talking to them. We want to hear from them. We want to hear the experiences of the election workers and some of the physical threats they faced. We want to hear about weaknesses in how elections are administered in those states that lead to certain vulnerabilities that might be exploited in the future. And I think people are anxious to talk to us in these states. So we'll do this, and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot, and hopefully we can do some good.
We intend to coordinate and cooperate with all of the other democracy NGOs in the country. They've been reaching out to us, and we to them, and so that our hope and expectation is that this will be one very large, coordinated national effort, of which the American Bar Association Task Force is just one part.
You're talking about sort of the sheer numbers of lawyers that we have out there. You want a big effort here. So how can people get involved? How can they help? There's more than 1 million lawyers. There's thousands and thousands of members of the ABA. This task force is launching. How do you want to sweep lawyers into this effort?
Well, I'd like to say that, just call 1-800-JUSTICE, but there's a website. I'm sure there's a way to reach relevant people through the website on the ABA. Just before we got on, I pulled our mission statement off the ABA website. So I'm sure that there's a way to do that. And if for no other reason, no other way to do it, my email is public here at Paul Weiss. When you're a professional service provider, you've got to be accessible and available. So, and people do write me with a fair amount of frequency, offering their help, and I save their letters and I send them forward.
David, the first thing that we have to do is convince the legal profession that to sit idly by silently is to participate in the demise of our American democracy and the rule of law. That's what I personally, and I'll only speak for myself personally, that's what I've witnessed across, America over the past 3 years by our elected public officials. They have been cowards, and in my view, they've betrayed their oaths of office by refusing even to engage the former president and his allies, in this tragic attack on the Constitution, the rule of law. But that's where we are in the political world. But our hope is that that's the last place that the legal profession will seek refuge. That's not what lawyers are supposed to do. And the 1.5 million lawyers in America, they know that that's not what they're supposed to do. And in this moment, they need to lead the effort. That is, the lawyers do.
There comes a point when silence is betrayal.
Yeah. True.
And that is particularly and uniquely true of the legal profession. We are, as Judge Luttig said, uniquely positioned and situated to appreciate the dangers of the violation of one's constitutional oath and the oath that lawyers take.
I think of it as a no and a yes. There is a no, I will not participate in efforts to overturn American democracy. I famously, Ken Paxton, who's the Texas Attorney General, filed one of the most laughably ridiculous lawsuits I've ever read, quite frankly, with the Supreme Court to try to overturn the results of the 2016 election, stop certification, et cetera. And there was an interesting thing about that. On the list of, attorneys of record, there was a name that wasn't there. And it was his own Solicitor General, who's a very respected attorney in the United States. And he said, no, there's a no. But there's also a no is a very good thing. But a yes is an even better thing. And the yes is to affirmatively volunteering, enlisting in the effort to defend American democracy from attacks that we know will come up in 2024. My last charge would be to think of it as a no. I refuse to participate in efforts to undermine democracy, and a yes, I will participate in efforts to defend democracy. And both are critically, critically important. Gentlemen, thank you very much. President Smith, thank you very much. I'm honored to participate and have this discussion. And I'll give you the last word, Mr. Secretary.
You said to me before we started, you'd hope we leave on a note of optimism.
Yes.
And I am optimistic that things will get better. If for no other reason, there are enough Americans, including lawyers, but not just lawyers, who care about our democracy, who are going to step forward. I do believe that the trajectory of our country is forever upward. It's in my DNA. And I want to read you something. My grandfather was a sociologist, and you were telling me you're from Tennessee. Mm-hmm. My grandfather was president of Fisk University in Nashville. He was a sociologist. He wrote a lot about civil rights. He lived his entire life in the Jim Crow South before he died in 1956. 1 month before he died, he wrote an essay in the New York Times magazine section about a Southern Negro's view of the South, for which he received many accolades and letters of praise, one of whom was from a 27-year-old minister in Alabama named Martin Luther King. And one of the things Dr. King said to my grandfather about this essay, you combine in this article the fact-finding mind of the social scientist with the moral insights of a religious prophet. So what did he say? I'm sure that King was referring to this particular paragraph, which I quote often, and it's in my DNA. It is variously expected that Negro Southerners, as a result of their limited status in the racial system, would be bitter or hostile or patient or indifferent. They are typically none of these. Bitterness grows out of hopelessness, and there is no sense of hopelessness in this situation. Faith in the ultimate strength of the democratic philosophy and code of the nation as a whole has always been stronger than the impulse to despair. My grandfather wrote that in September 1956, a month before he died, and I believe it too.
That's a fantastic final word. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Judge. And thank you, President Smith.
Thanks, David. And if you would like to get involved with the ABA Task Force for American Democracy, go to ambar.org/democracy. Thank you so much to David, Secretary Johnson, and Judge Luttig for this important conversation. And consider joining the American Bar Association. Go to ambar.org/membership. And stay tuned for upcoming episodes of the ABA Presidential Speaker Series. We will announce new episodes after the new year. Thanks so much for joining us today.